When we were born, when our moms and dads joined together to create us, God took a spirit from His little reservoir of spirits, and He sent to that little child that was conceived, that began growing inside the mother's womb, a spirit that is unique, that was specially designed by God for a special purpose. Now, all of us have a variety of things that we can do, a variety of things that we like to do. But in each of those little spirits that God created, that He sent to the womb to be born into who we are today, each of us has a unique combination of abilities and likes and contributions that we as individuals can make. God formed each of us to be a special servant in a special way in His world, and for those of us who are Christians, in His kingdom. We are formed by God to serve. And so the lesson this morning is on that very topic, the idea of service. We have been created to serve. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 43, Jesus says, "Whoever is going to be the greatest among you, let him serve." Turn over to Luke chapter 22. Let's read some verses there from this same context, Jesus' discussion with His disciples. But let's read the passages from Luke's account of Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 34. Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 23, rather. Luke 22, verse 23. They began, that is, the apostles began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to do this thing, to betray Him. And there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be greatest. Now, could you put yourselves in the assembly of the apostles and listen to them arguing over which one is the greatest apostle? We can picture Peter saying, "I'm the one that's always speaking up in defense of Jesus. I am the best apostle that He has." We can see John speaking up and saying, "Look, everybody knows that I am his favorite apostle. I am the greatest." We can see Andrew speaking up and saying, "Look, I'm the one that's always bringing people to Jesus. I'm the most evangelistic among us. In fact, Peter, I'm the one that brought you to Jesus. I am the greatest." Can you picture these men arguing among themselves, who is the greatest apostle? Things haven't changed any, have they? And so Jesus said to them, verse 25, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them." What's He saying? He's saying, men, the pagans, act like you're acting. "And those who have authority over them are called benefactors." They have titles of distinction in the pagan world. But, verse 26, "it is not this way with you. But the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant." For who is greater? The one who reclines at the table, or the one who serves? When they had a banquet, of course, it was not the one who was the greatest who was the one who was serving. He's the one that's already sitting at the table. He's the one that is being served. So is it not the one who reclines at the table that's the greatest? But I am among you as the one who serves. I am among you as the one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and just as my Father granted me a kingdom, I grant you, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus goes on to say, when He talks about judging the 12 tribes of Israel, He's telling His apostles, you all have equal authority in my kingdom. There's no super apostles, there's no lesser apostles. But the point He is really wanting to emphasize is the idea of service. Now, we have read, many of us probably, have read books on leadership. You go to the bookstore and there's going to be a good section on leadership. I've got some books by John Maxwell on leadership. But how many books can you find in the bookstore on being a servant? But we don't want to do that. ones who are forgotten about. Servants are the ones who don't receive any glory. So we want to be out front. We want to be the leader. But the mark of maturity in God's kingdom is having the heart of a servant. Following in the footsteps of Jesus and being willing to serve. Now, are we servants today? Are we servants? Do we have the heart of servants? Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 16, that you will know His disciples by their fruits. And so this morning I'm going to present 6 characteristics of a servant's heart. 6 characteristics that we can look at and say, okay, I want to be a servant, therefore I need to do this. To be a servant of Jesus Christ. First of all, servants make themselves available to serve. Now, we can get so tied up, so enrolled in our lives that we don't have time to serve God in His church. But that's not the heart of a servant. A servant's heart is like the National Guardsmen, who are on call at all times, who are willing to step in and go when their governor or their president says it's time to go. Now, Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, talking about Christians now, he says, no man who is engaged in war entangles himself in the affairs of this life, so that he might serve the one who has enlisted him. And so you and I have to be willing to allow our schedules to be interrupted when God calls us into service. And sometimes we don't like that. Especially those of us who are geared towards setting goals and working toward those goals, even daily goals or weekly goals, and we've got this mindset that says, I have to get this accomplished. And then God brings somebody into our lives and it interrupts our schedule, and we say, I don't have time for that, I've got other things to do. But if God has brought somebody into our lives and interrupted our schedule, God is saying, I need you right now. And I've put you in this situation right now to serve me by serving this individual in a special way. And so we need to understand that interruptions are God's way of calling us into service. So a servant who has a servant's heart is first of all willing to serve wherever God has called us. Second of all, a servant who has a servant's heart is willing to look for needs that need to be fulfilled. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, the Apostle Paul says, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of the faith. And so we need to look for opportunities of service that need to be fulfilled. For those of us who are parents, we try to teach our children, if you see something that needs to be done, do it. Take care of it. Don't say, oh, I'm going to let Mom and Daddy do that if there's garbage on the floor or whatever. I see a need that needs to be done, that needs to be fulfilled, I'm going to do it. That is the heart of a servant. And if we want to have a servant's heart, then we need to look for things that need to be done and then do it. I know in the congregation that the elders would be tickled, are tickled when people say, here's something that needs to be done, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take care of it. Turn over to James chapter 2. And let's read a few verses here about James talking about putting our faith into action. James chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. Faith, if it is going to be an active faith, if it's going to be a living faith, then it has to be a faith that works. Now, we oftentimes use this passage in our discussions with our friends and other religious groups to show that we're not saved by faith only. We're not saved by praying and asking Jesus to come to our heart. Because James here says faith that it does not have works is dead because it's alone. And that's an appropriate use of this text, but that's not what James is talking about. James is talking to Christians who are not putting their faith into brethren, James chapter 2, if someone says he has faith but he has no works, can that faith save him? Can an inactive faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," but you have not given him the things that are necessary for the body, what use is that? So then, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Now here in the context of James chapter 2, James says that you've got a congregation where a wealthy man comes in and you let him sit in the most prominent places, but a poor man comes in and because he doesn't look like the rest of us, you put him back in the corner and let him sit by himself. Here it goes on to say that poor man may need to have clothes, that poor man may need to have some food. And you may say, "Well, God bless you, poor man," but if you don't do anything to help him, what good is your faith? Your faith is useless because it's not working. And so an individual who follows in the footsteps of Jesus looks for opportunities to serve. It doesn't sit back and wait. It doesn't sit back and say, "Well, I hope that what needs to be done gets done," but rather they say, "I will step in and I will do what I can." Third, the ones who have a servant's heart does the best they can with what they have. Do you remember when Moses was in the wilderness of Midian at the burning bush? And God says, "Moses, I want you to go back into Egypt." Moses has been gone for 40 years. God says, "Moses, I want you to go back into Egypt and I want you to lead my people out of Egypt." And Moses starts making excuses. Now, that's one point that we can make, and that is servants, when they're called into service, don't start making excuses. Moses was making an excuse on this occasion. And he says, "God, how can I do this?" And God's question to Moses was, "What do you have in your hand?" What do you have in your hand? Now, in Moses' situation, he had a rod in his hand. What good's a rod? God says, "Moses, throw it down on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground. And we all know it turned into a snake. God says, "Moses, grab the snake." Moses grabbed the snake and turned back into a rod. What do you have in your hand? The message for us is, what are we doing with what we have? Servants with a servant heart do the best they can with what they have. I love this little poem somebody wrote. Shamgar had an ox goad. Rahab had a string. Gideon had a trumpet. David had a sling. Samson had a jawbone. Moses had a rod. Dorcas had a needle. But all were used for God. What do we have in our hands that God can use in service to Him and service to the church? Take a moment and look over at Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 4. Ecclesiastes is in the middle of the Old Testament, right after Psalms and Proverbs. Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon, the preacher from Jerusalem. Solomon had experienced everything that you could possibly imagine. He had an education, he had money. He had power, he had prestige, he had women. He had all the pleasures of this life. And Solomon's message in the book of Ecclesiastes is, if you don't serve God, it's all worthless. It's all for nothing. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and look at what Solomon says in verse 4. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. What is Solomon saying? Solomon's saying if you're always worried about what might happen and you don't actually do anything, then you're not going to accomplish anything. Now, several of us grow gardens, and this is the time of year when we're starting to plant some things. We plant some things that right now